Forget what you think you know about where Iran begins. Forget the grand mosques, the marble courts, the silk-draped caravans of Isfahan. In 1554, that glittering empire capital does not yet exist. What you are stepping into today is something far more raw, far more dangerous, and far more extraordinary. Close your eyes. Breathe in. The first thing to hit you is not incense, not rosewater. It is dust, thick, alkaline, Alborz mountain dust, carried south on a dry autumn wind off the peaks that tower over this valley like the spine of the world itself. Then comes the smell of pomegranates, hundreds of them, splitting open in garden after garden that rings this strange, formless settlement like a living wall. This is Tehran, but not the Tehran you know. Right now, in the year 1554, Tehran is neither city nor village. It is something in between a ghost town of legends, a Shia holy ground, a fruit garden the size of a small kingdom, with no walls, no central market, and a population of perhaps 15,000 souls quietly living in a secret the rest of the Persian world barely notices. But all of that is about to change, forever, because right now on horseback, his red-capped Kizilbash warriors fanned out behind him across the ochre plain. Shah Tahmasp I, second ruler of the Safavid dynasty, the man who has held off the most powerful sultan on earth, is riding toward this forgotten orchard town. And he has an idea. Here is what history books and Hollywood want you to believe about Safavid Persia: gleaming turquoise domes, rose gardens, philosophers sipping tea and composing poetry. A civilization so refined that European ambassadors reportedly wept at its beauty. And yes, parts of that are true. The Safavids were genuine patrons of art on a scale most European courts couldn't match. Shah Tahmasp's personal royal atelier produced the legendary illuminated Shahnameh, a manuscript so magnificent it now lives in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Persian carpets from this era were so prized that European kings paid fortunes to import them. But here is what they don't tell you. In 1554, the year Tahmasp rides toward Tehran, his empire is not at peace, it is bleeding. For 22 years, since 1532, 3 campaigns have been launched against Persia by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, the most feared military commander on the planet. 3 times, Ottoman armies have swept into Azerbaijan. Tabriz, the original Safavid capital, the crown jewel of Persian culture, has already fallen to the Ottomans once, in 1534. The trauma of that loss is so severe that Tahmasp moved his entire capital further inland to Kazvin, simply to stay out of cannon range. And right now, in 1554, Suleiman's forces are on the move again. The road from Baghdad to Tabriz is not paved with silk, it is scorched. Tahmasp's strategy against the Ottomans has been brutal and deliberate: scorched earth. Burn the crops, empty the granaries, poison the wells, force the Ottoman army to starve in a landscape stripped of everything that could feed it. It works. But the people who pay the price are not soldiers. They are farmers, herders, village women, the silent thousands who watch their entire world reduced to ash so that their empire can survive. Let's go back even further, because to understand why what happens in 1554 matters so much, you need to understand what Tehran really was. It began as a suburb of a ghost, the great city of Rey, also known as Ragi in ancient texts, mentioned in the Zoroastrian Avesta as one of the 12 sacred cities created by the god Ahura Mazda himself, once sat 5 miles south of where Tehran would eventually rise. Before the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, Rey was a metropolis of 500,000 people, a Silk Road titan, a center of silk weaving, scholarship, and trade so important that the Islamic geographer Ibn Hawqal devoted pages to its markets. Then, in 1220 AD, the Mongols came. The chronicles are unambiguous. Virtually the entire population of Rey was massacred. In a single campaign, one of the greatest cities in the Islamic world simply ceased to exist. The survivors ran north. They ran toward the cool shadow of the Alborz Mountains. They ran to Tehran, and what they found there was strange. Tehran was not a typical settlement. It had 12 rival neighborhoods whose inhabitants dug their homes underground, not caves, but engineered subterranean houses cut into the earth, cool in summer, insulating in winter, surrounded by rings of dense orchards. The people of these 12 neighborhoods were so fiercely independent that medieval chroniclers noted they routinely defied the central government. They were known across Persia for exactly two things: their political stubbornness and the incomparable sweetness of their pomegranates. For 300 years after the Mongol destruction of Ray, Tehran quietly existed in this semi-wild state. No walls, no official city status, no central administration. A Spanish ambassador passing through in 1404 described it as vast, not bound by any walls, which is green and lush, with all that is required for comfort. He sounded almost confused by it, this enormous, prosperous place that refused to be a city. But then came another reason for Tahmasp's interest. Buried near the shrines of Ray was a man named Sayyid Hamza, one of the Safavid dynasty's own ancestral forebears. When Safavid kings came to visit Hamza's tomb, they passed through Tehran, and Tahmasp noticed something. Tehran was protected by geography in a way no other city in the region was. The Alborz to the north, the open plain to the south, easy to defend, impossible to besiege from multiple directions, and it was far enough from Tabriz, that bleeding wound of a former capital, to feel safe. "Build it," Tahmasp ordered, and so they did. Here is the single most astonishing number of this story: 114. Not a coincidence, not an engineer's approximation. Exactly 114 towers, spaced along a square perimeter wall, rising from Tehran's plain in 1554 by Shah Tahmasp's direct command. 114, the precise number of surahs in the Holy Quran. Every stone mason who laid those foundations knew what he was building. Every soldier who would one day stand in those towers would know what they were guarding. This was not just a military fortification. It was a declaration written in limestone and mortar. This city belongs to God and to Shia Islam, and the timing could not be more charged. Right now, while those towers are going up, the third and final Ottoman campaign is underway. In May 1554, Suleiman the Magnificent, who has described himself as the shadow of God on earth, who commands perhaps the most lethal professional army ever assembled in the medieval world, has marched from Diyarbakir toward the Caucasus. His target, the Safavid heartland. Tahmasp does not panic. He has learned patience the hard way after 22 years of this war. "The Ottoman army is like syphilis," Tahmasp wrote in his own memoir. "If you try to cure it at the onset of attack, it will kill the patient. You must monitor the disease and let it do as it wishes. Then it can easily be cured." He splits his own army into 4 corps, sending each in a different direction. A strategic dispersal that leaves Suleiman no concentrated target to destroy. The Ottoman Sultan captures plunder but wins nothing decisive. With both empires exhausted, on May 29, 1555, the Peace of Amasya is signed. The Ottomans keep Baghdad and much of Mesopotamia. Persia keeps Azerbaijan and, crucially, Tabriz. The frontier that will define the region for a generation is drawn. And Tehran, its 114 towers now standing, its first central bazaar now open, sits protected and ready. Not quite a capital, not quite a city, but no longer just a fruit garden either. Something new has been born here. The Safavids just don't know yet how important it will become. You cannot tell the story of Tehran 1554 without confronting the darkest chapter of how Tahmasp built his new world. Between 1540 and 1554, the same years he was building walls and fighting Suleiman, Shah Tahmasp conducted a series of military raids into the Caucasus Mountains, into Georgia, into Circassia, into Armenia. The objective was not just territory. The objective was people. In his final campaign alone, in 1554, Tahmasp's forces brought 30,000 Georgian captives back into Persia. Over the entire campaign period, historians estimate the total at more than 70,000 individuals, Georgians, Armenians, Circassians, ripped from their homes, their families, their language, and their faith. Nestin Derjan, the mother of the Georgian king Suleiman I, was captured during these raids. Rather than submit to captivity, she took her own life. These were not anonymous masses. They were craftsmen, scholars, warriors, noblewomen, And the Safavid system did something complicated with them. It absorbed them, elevated many of them, and ultimately made them into what historians call the third force of the empire, a new class of royal servants and soldiers, alongside the original Turkoman Kizilbash and Persian administrative elite. Some would rise to positions of enormous power. Some would become generals. Some would become mothers of future shahs. But to get there, they crossed rivers in chains. This is the hidden cost of Safavid civilization's most dazzling achievements. The intricate carpets, the illuminated manuscripts, the ordered bazaars, built on a foundation of forced displacement on a scale that was, by any measure, catastrophic for those who lived through it. 30,000 people marched south through the Alborz passes, into the same Tehran valley that was, at that very moment, receiving its first permanent walls. Here is the paradox at the heart of Tehran's founding. Tahmasp built his 114-towered wall large enough to contain 100,000 people. The actual population at the time, 15 to 20,000. The proportion was so striking that historians still puzzle over it. An enormous, militarily engineered shell wrapped around a modest market town. Why build so large? The answer, most scholars now agree, was strategic foresight of a particular kind. Tahmasp needed a forward military base, a garrison position in the interior that could receive and shelter an entire army on the march, with all its equipment, supplies, and animals. The walls weren't for the farmers, they were for the soldiers. Tehran in 1554 was less a city than a strategic weapon, but something unexpected happened. The walls stayed. The bazaar Tahmasp built, modest as it was at first, just open-air market rows in the Safavid style, began to accumulate merchants, caravanserais, mosques, shrines. The Aldlajan neighborhood, already ancient by Safavid standards, grew into a commercial heartbeat. Pilgrims coming to visit Sayyid Hamza's tomb stopped in Tehran's market. Travelers on the Khorasan Road, the great highway linking east and west through Persia's interior, discovered that Tehran had cold water from mountain springs, shade from its legendary orchards, and now a place to buy and sell. The city that Tahmasp built as a military garrison became, slowly and stubbornly, a real city. One day in 1786, more than 2 centuries after those 114 towers went up, a new dynasty, the Qajars, would choose Tehran as the capital of the entire Persian Empire. Today, that same city is home to 9 million people in the city proper. The Alborz still stands above it. The orchards are long gone, but Tehran's Grand Bazaar, whose roots reach directly back to 1554, still operates today, still trades, still breathes. Here is what I want you to take with you. Tehran in 1554 is not a triumph. It is not a tragedy. It is something more honest than either of those things. It is a place built by survivors on top of the ruins of survivors. The people who lived in those underground houses had already outlasted a genocide that killed 500,000 of their neighbors. They had rebuilt without being asked. They had planted orchards in a valley that history had largely forgotten, and grown the sweetest pomegranates in Persia, without anyone ever telling them they were remarkable. The captives who marched through those valleys in chains, Georgians, Armenians, Circassians, would see their children and grandchildren rise to command armies, paint masterpieces, and shape one of the most sophisticated court cultures the medieval world had ever seen. It is a brutal irony. It is also an undeniable truth. And Tahmasp himself, this complicated, deeply religious, sometimes paranoid, brilliant strategist of a Shah, built 114 towers not because he needed 114 towers. He built them because he was a man who believed that a city wall could be an act of prayer, that stone and mortar could speak to God, that an empire under siege from the most powerful military force on earth could still pause in the middle of a war and build something beautiful. The pomegranates are still growing in Tehran's memory, even if the orchards are paved now. The 114 towers are long gone, demolished across the centuries by modernization, earthquakes, and the carelessness of time. But the market they protected still breathes, still trades, still draws people from every direction into its covered lanes. just as it did in 1554 when the first stalls opened under a reed roof on a dry autumn afternoon in a valley at the foot of the Alborz. Tehran didn't become a great city because of power. It became a great city because people kept refusing to let it disappear. Remember that.